Hello, my friends and fellow travelers. My name is Pierce. This is my channel, Tales from the Road. Thanks so much for stopping by. If you've been here before, you know these travel guides are all about giving you the real deal travel information to help you travel better. In this video, we're going to talk about Berlin, a city that I love, a very unique place in Europe, a place where East meets West and where the modern Europe is being built right now, today, and a city with so much to see. If you like history, if you like food, if you like culture, if you like to club, Berlin is the spot for you. So, in this video, I'm going to tell you everything you need to know before you go in order to make sure that you have an epic and memorable time in the German capital. If that sounds good, let's do it. Auf geht's. So as we always do with these videos, let's talk about a little historical information so you can get to know Berlin a little better before you go. But before I tell you about Berlin, I wanted to take you outside to my hometown here in Italy and tell you more about The Trip, a travel agency I've been building for the last year with a good friend of mine who's also from Italy. Coming from a person who knows just a little bit about travel, I would say that there's the easy type of travel and the hard type of travel. The easy travel, I think, is the solo travel. You pick where you want to go and you buy tickets and you go. Simple. I would say the harder type of travel is, of course, traveling in groups. Group travel is always chaos. People want to do different things, people have different dates, people need to make all kinds of different decisions all at the same time, the booking is complicated, and of course there's always that one friend who just doesn't answer the group chat. This is why my friend Sada and I have built The Trip. It's a travel agency specifically for group travel. We do all the hard part, you just show up and go on your trip. We built this product with simplicity in mind, but we wanted to make sure that it was customizable, because there's nothing worse than being on a group trip that you didn't really plan and you go to a bunch of places you didn't want to go to. The way The Trip works is pretty simple. We've built the skeleton for you, and then you can customize on top of it. Basically, we created a 10-day trip. We picked the locations, we booked the hotels, we book all the transportation, and we've partnered with many local businesses in each one of these locations to provide really unique and interesting experiences, such as wine tasting in Italy, a club tour of Berlin, or surfing classes on the coast of Mexico. This idea makes it simpler for you, benefits local communities, and makes amazing memories for groups who find it hard to get going. If you want to learn more about The Trip, I've got a link in the description. Now, let's get on to the content about Berlin. First and foremost, Berlin is the capital of Germany. It's found in the northeastern part of the country, and is one of the largest cities in the country as well, with almost 3.85 million people in the metropolitan area. The story of Berlin is long and complex. It's a city with a very long life. It's a city that's had many changes, many identities, and many unique moments throughout history. First and foremost, it really became the imperial heartland of what we consider modern Germany today, after the Prussian Empire, which was basically a lot of northern Germany, decided to work to unify the country with Berlin as their capital city. This meant that Berlin became the bustling economic and political hub of a new large Germanic people nation. Berlin was built with modern architecture, all of the trappings of a modern imperial city, and it became a hub for writing, culture, art, science in the Germanic region. Moving towards the industrial age, Berlin changed just as the German nation did. The German Empire fell after World War I, and all of this imperial power that was centered in Berlin left with the empire. Berlin changed to being a hub for film and art and culture and sort of this fringe identity that really connects with Berlin today. That was during the time of the Weimar Republic, the first tested democracy of Germany, and I think this impression on Berlin never changed after that, which is very interesting. Of course, Berlin became the center of Nazism and fascism in Germany during World War II, and because of that was absolutely destroyed during the war that subsequently followed. That means in the story of Berlin, again, a new identity was forged from the rubble of World War II. The next identity Berlin took was a city that was split by Soviet occupation, by Western occupation, and it became the center of the Cold War in many cases, and a sort of miniature scale of what was happening around the world throughout the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. This can, of course, be most notably seen by the Berlin Wall, which was the most physical representation of the Iron Curtain at the moment. After the fall of the wall in the late 1980s, Berlin then became a representation of a newly unified Germany, an Eastern Germany and a Western Germany, reborn, reunified, reintegrated, and back to full power. Today's Berlin is that city embodied in the new modern European system. It's a vibrant city with a lot of students, with a lot of opportunities. It's a financial hub. It's a hub for technology and innovation. And most importantly, it's a beautiful city with so much history to see. So let's talk about that in the practical section. Visas. Germany, of course, is a European Union nation. They're in the Schengen zone, and I have a whole video about this if you're more interested in it, but you get 90 days as an American when you arrive in the Schengen zone. So that means if you go to the Netherlands, if you go to Spain, if you go to Italy, that removes time that you can spend in Berlin. If you just want to spend 90 days in Berlin, you certainly can. So now on to money. In Berlin, you're going to use the euro when you visit. And right now the euro is about 0.9 euros equals $1. So when you buy something for 10 euros, it's something like $11 or $12, depending on the exchange rate of the day. You can just think of whatever you buy in Berlin being marginally more expensive than the price that you see on the menu or on the Airbnb that you're booking. For a long time, Berlin was always notably cheaper than other major German cities like Munich or Hamburg. Number one, because it was in Eastern Germany, and the Eastern German cities were just economically behind the Western German cities. And number two is that the government really put some price-controlled fixing, especially on the rent, to keep the overall price of Berlin cheap. 5-10 years ago, Berlin was a very good deal. Today, things in Berlin have certainly got more expensive and are more competitive along with the larger major German hubs around the country. I would say that you can get away with getting a meal in Berlin for around 12 to 15, 16 euros at most restaurants. Of course, they push a little bit higher if you want like authentic German food because of the big meat portions that you're going to find. Drinks in Berlin, normally you can find beers certainly for under 5 euros, maybe under 4 or 3, depending on if you know the right place to go. And accommodations have actually gotten quite expensive. Hotels in Berlin are ranging between 120 and 150 euros a night on the higher end. And you can get away with 80 to 100, maybe on the lower end. The rent, specifically if you're doing short-term rent like Airbnb or Booking.com apartments, the prices of those have gone quite up. So that's something to note. So don't plan on Berlin being any necessarily cheaper than visiting Amsterdam or Brussels or Paris as far as the apartments are concerned. This is sort of a rule of thumb for a lot of major European cities these days, especially with the inflation since 2020. I would categorize Berlin in the medium price range. It's not as expensive as London. It's not as expensive as Paris, but it's certainly not as cheap as other Central European and definitely Eastern European countries. Transportation. One thing I really love about Berlin is although it's a big city, the transportation network in and out of the city is really good. Within the city, they have buses, they have trams, they have the U-Bahn, which is the subway, and they also have a sort of light rail that goes above, which is called the S-Bahn, which takes you, I guess, longer distances, but it sort of is connected to the U-Bahn, so it's really easy to navigate in general. So getting around the city, not a big deal if you like public transportation. You can, of course, take taxis and Ubers when you're in Berlin, although they are certainly not the cheapest. Getting to Berlin is pretty easy. They now have one major airport, which took forever to build and was a huge catastrophe for the city of Berlin, but it's the Brandenburg International Airport, and that's the logical airport that you'd fly into and out of if you're planning a trip to Berlin. Berlin also is in a good spot if you'd like to travel to other cities within Germany by train or by bus. It's not too far from Leipzig and Dresden. These are some major Eastern German cities. You could, of course, go to Hamburg or Hanover or Bremen, also not too far. If you want to go to the south of Germany, the distance starts to add up a little bit, and taking the train is going to be over 5 hours probably. Also, if you want to go to the east, like to Poland or to the Czech Republic, like visiting Prague, Berlin is also not terribly far from these places. So if you're doing a little Central European trip, Berlin is a good hub place to start. The one thing I would say about Berlin transportation I'm not a fan of is the fact that the city is made up of really cool neighborhoods surrounded by neighborhoods that are just very residential. So it means if you're walking, the distances can be kind of far and you won't necessarily see a bunch of stuff on your way. A lot of people like to say in the middle of Berlin called Mitte, but in Mitte it's just sort of a financial district and it's certainly not the best place to walk around and see the sights. The best way to get around Berlin is certainly by U-Bahn, S-Bahn, bus, tram, and taxi. Safety and security. I think Berlin falls into the category of just your general large European city. There are some sketchy people. There are mostly normal people. There are tourists. There are drunk tourists. It's like a normal mix of what you would normally expect to find. I will say Berlin definitely has some sort of seedy, nightlife, anarchic sort of vibe to it. It's a city with a lot of stuff going on with a very particular identity. And I think the nightlife and the sort of subculture that Berlin exists in, this sort of everything happening in squat houses, very alternative, very sort of unregulated, leads to there being potentially more sketchiness or unsafe feelings than other parts of cities that you would normally go to in Europe. But for some, that is the charm of Berlin. So it really just depends on what you're into. Another major benefit for American travelers is when you go to Berlin, you can speak English basically everywhere, and everyone will be able to communicate with you. I think very rarely would you find a person living in Berlin, like an actual Berliner German person, that doesn't speak English. So if you go to hotels, hostels, if you're going out to eat, I think functioning in English is really, really easy. And even if you speak German, a lot of the Germans don't even want to speak to you in German just because they feel like they're doing the right thing by making your life easier speaking English. So that's like a nice little benefit to this, nice modern European hub city. So now on to my favorite section, which is food. I think the food in Berlin is really good. Not necessarily the German food. It's not any better than what you would find in any other city, but the fact that Berlin is a super international city. You can find really good, authentic international food from all the areas of the world. It's kind of like New York City, but on a small. If you want to find really authentic Japanese food, Chinese food, Indian food, Latin American, Brazilian food, if you want to find African stuff, Turkish stuff, Arabic stuff, Russian stuff, it's all there, and you can find stores and markets to also shop at if you're into that thing. The restaurant scene in Berlin is fantastic. They also have a lot of pop-ups, they have a lot of food markets, and you can really eat super well in this city. A cool example I remember of this from when I lived in Berlin was there was this small community of Thai people who liked to cook authentic Thai food. They all went to a park on Sundays during the summer, and they would sell the Thai food for a very reasonable price, and it was as authentic as what I would get in Thailand. Very, very special. If you want to discover the food of Berlin, I think a good place to start is Currywurst. Currywurst, or curry sausage, is a traditional sort of street snack that you can find all over the city. Basically, it's a sausage that they fry, they cut up, and then they cover in a curry ketchup sort of sweet and tangy sauce. It was apparently invented in Berlin in the mid-70s and really has become the identity of German food culture all around Germany and abroad. You always have to have it with fries too, with a little bit of mayonnaise. Very good. Next up, you need to try doner kebab, or doner kebab if you want to say it that way. Doner kebab, of course, came via Turkey. It was certainly made by Turkish immigrants, but the doner kebab itself morphed and sort of mixed with German tastes, and what we consider today a normal doner kebab is certainly a Berliner thing. The famous place that I like to go to when I'm in Berlin is Mustafa's Gemüse Kebab. I always say this, it's not a promotion for them, but it's honestly one of my favorite ones. They make their own bread, they only use chicken, and they actually put the potatoes and other vegetables kind of like already cooked underneath the kebab that's spinning, so all that nice fat and grease goes onto the vegetables. It's honestly like the best thing ever. If you have a chance to go to Mustafa's Gemüse Kebab, I would definitely recommend it. One of my favorite German restaurants, if you want to try good German Berlin food when you go to Berlin, is a place called Dicke Wörter. Funny name, I think, for the American people, but this place, it's like an old sort of German pub. It gets very crowded. They have really traditional bratwurst and cabbage and other Prussian dishes, Wiener Schnitzel, a very East German, Central European food. Big portions, really, really tasty, and really good with any type of German beer. It's just like the experience that you're looking for if you want something really Berliner, like something really, really German on your stay in a city that's otherwise quite different. This is a very different vibe than the rest of Germany. Also, if you want to try something sweet, you should try Berliner, which is a donut, basically fried and stuffed with cream and topped with powdered sugar. Super tasty and notable because John F. Kennedy said, "Ich bin ein Berliner," when he visited the city back in the 60s during the Cold War. And basically he just said, "I am a donut," in German, which is very funny. People found it, which is of course very funny and very tasty. So now we're going to talk about the best things to do in Berlin. Of course, you can find a guide online with your top 10 things to do. I'm going to give you some impressions of some of my favorites, and I'm going to tell you about the neighborhoods of Berlin and which ones you should definitely check out. I think the start of any good trip to Berlin starts around the Friedrich Strasse area. This is really the center of old Berlin, and it has many of the famous buildings and sites that I think a lot of people want to see on their trip to the city, including the Brandenburg Gate, very famous, very picturesque. There's a street with all the embassies that was sort of split during the Berlin Wall era. It's a very, very cool part of the city. You can, of course, see the Holocaust Museum. You can go to Museum Insel, or basically Museum Island, which has many famous, very epic museums. And of course, you can finish your time there with a visit to the Reichstag or the German Parliament House. All of that area is very epic. You can walk around. It is very touristy as far as people visiting Berlin. I mean, that's kind of the point. But I think if you want to get to know the city and, of course, see really good museums, that's a good place to start. Next, if you walk a little bit south of that area, you'll find yourself in Friedrich Strasse, where you'll find Checkpoint Charlie, which is the famous sort of border post between Old East and West Berlin. At Checkpoint Charlie, you'll be able to get in touch with the Cold War history, and they have a fantastic Cold War museum with all of the details about how the wall went up, what it meant, what the DDR was, and of course how it affected modern Berlin today. Next up, you can head to the Berliner Innenstadt, or the inner city of Berlin, and you can see, of course, Alexanderplatz, which is a very famous square with the very reminiscent and iconic TV tower. This area is a good shopping center, and this is the area where you really start to feel the Eastern Berlin kick in, because you can see a lot of the Soviet-esque era block houses, and the vibe sort of change. In this area, too, you can see the Rotes Rathaus, which is a very old, beautiful imperial city hall that used to be an important building, obviously, during the imperial times. It's very cool, the juxtaposition between the TV tower and Alexanderplatz and this very old imperial building. What you can also do to shake it up is to visit the Nikolai Viertel, or Nicholas's Quarter. And this is a cool, renovated medieval era part of Berlin. And it feels like stepping foot into a small village with really cool, small German shops. It's very reminiscent of a small town that you would visit in Germany today. So all within basically a kilometer, you can see East Berlin, you can see the Imperial Germany, you can see basically the ancient past of Berlin. And then if you walk a little bit north to Hackischer Markt, which is a very big, famous shopping street with old sort of imperial buildings as well, you can sort of finish your tour of the inner city, and you've seen basically all the forms of Berlin without having to move so much, and that's why that's so special. Next up, you can head to East Berlin, where the city changes a lot, the vibe changes a lot, and you can see sort of the rugged underbelly of Berlin that is renewing itself, but still is very different than the imperial side that was sort of kept in the western part of Berlin. Eastern Berlin, number one, you can see the East Side Gallery, which is the old remnants of the Berlin Wall. You can see, of course, the famous paintings that were made during the time in the late 80s before they pulled the wall down. And it is, I think, the number one thing to do in the city. It's very trendy. You can take pictures there, and it is very cool. You can even get a passport stamp if you want to stamp your passport saying you visited East Berlin, which is a gimmick, but I find it kind of funny. It also sits on the Spree River, and the Spree River is very beautiful. In the summer, you can sit out and you can sit along the river, walk along the river. It's a good way to see Berlin. You could just walk on the river. And there's a lot of interesting bars and restaurants and, of course, clubs that sit along the river as well. Some trendy areas you may want to check out that have very cool but very Berlin-esque bars and restaurants and clubs and all that stuff are Prenzlauer Berg, which is in the eastern Berlin to the northern part. You have Friedrichshain, which is very close to that as well. You have Kreuzberg, which is a very, very famous sort of hipster part of Berlin. Lots of really good restaurants. It's a little bit trendy, but it's still a little bit dirty. That's the sort of Berlin vibe. Trendy, but dirty. I think that's really how Berlin goes. And you could go visit the place where I lived, which was called Bergmann Kiez, which has very beautiful old imperial style sort of housing buildings. And it's right on Tempelhof Park, which is a massive park that actually used to be one of the airports in Berlin. They took the airport apart, and now it's just a massive park that you can go chill in with your friends, have a barbecue, drink a couple beers. It's like a beautiful place to be out during the summer for sure. Berlin during the winter is a tough one because Berlin is very cold. It can be windy, it can be rainy, it can be snowing sideways. So I think if you're going to do all of this stuff in the winter, you're going to come in the maybe February time, in the October time, make a plan, pick what's inside, pick what's outside, pick your places in advance. And if you want to go clubbing, just be prepared to stand outside in the cold. That's the Berlin vibe. If you go during the summer, of course, it's a lot easier. You get a lot more daylight, and all of the parks and the outdoor vibe that Berlin has is of course accessible. And I think honestly that's the best part of the city for me, is the summer, sitting in parks, walking through the streets. It's just a very unique city. Everywhere you walk, there's something historic, something interesting, some new pop-up restaurant, something to do, right? Endless museums, endless things to do. As a last note, I would be remiss if I did not talk about the clubbing scene in Berlin, because that is a thing that many people like to do. There's a lot of things online talking about the clubs and how to get in them and what the vibe is. So what I would say first off, the vibe in Berlin is not fancy. When you club in Milan, when you club in Paris, when you club in London, New York City, you want to dress up, you want to dress nice, you want to look super presentable. In Berlin, you can think whatever the presentable thing is, Berlin is doing the opposite. So in Berlin, you don't want to look too over the top. You don't want to look like preppy. Like, that's just not the vibe. Wearing black is always good. Wearing something LGBTQ is always good if you want to go to the clubs. Berlin clubbing is also targeted at an older group, maybe late 20s, early 30s, as opposed to the younger inhabitants, 18 through 21. That means that they want you to be a little bit more serious. They don't like people who are overly drunk or who are on drugs before they get into the club. And typically you hear things like you need to speak German to get into the club or whatever. It's a good strategy. They definitely don't like tourists in clubs. That's just sort of how it is. The thing is, I lived in Berlin for 3 months. I visited Berlin a lot in my life, and clubs are really, as a foreigner, they're really hit or miss. I mean, am I the coolest guy in the world? I don't know. But realistically, getting to clubs is going to be a 50-50. The weird part about Berlin and what's different about the clubbing situation there is that for women, it's also 50-50. Many women in many other cities, they almost have a guaranteed access to clubs. In Berlin, that's not the case. It's very democratized, and it's very about the feeling of the bouncer. Some nights you stand in a club, you get in the first shot. Sometimes you stand in the line for the club, you don't get in, you go to another one, you don't get in, you go to another one, you don't get in, and that's just the night in Berlin that you have. So I think there are definitely some tricks to getting into clubs, but realistically, it's sort of out of your control. What you can control is don't be goofy in the line, don't come in a group of 25 loud Americans, and if you wear black and just look like a normal person, there's a chance that you're gonna get in there. I would say for me, the clubs that I really enjoy are Trésor and Watergate. The Watergate is a little bit more chill music and chill vibe. Trésor is very much the very hard Berlin, dark sort of electronic dance music that really defines the city. But Berlin has so many clubs. They pop up all the time. They close all the time. And so for me, having not been there in a couple of years, I might be off. But there are the legendary clubs like Trésor, like Watergate, which have been staples of the city for years and years and years. If you want a weird club, a funny club, I think Kit Kat Club is the sort of the funniest, strangest one that you can go to. A little bit into the kink land of things. That's always a place people like to check out. But again, if you're not in it 100%, you're not going to get in, is kind of my point. As a final note, and one thing that I personally love about Berlin is that Berlin has almost 1 million Turkish people in it. That means that Berlin has super authentic Turkish-related things, and I would say it's the most Turkish place outside of Turkey I've ever personally been. If you go to Neukölln, which is a southeastern part of the city, it's also a very beautiful city with nice stuff to do and good museums. You'll find a very heavily influenced Turkish population, really good restaurants, really good dessert places, and if you want to see a different side of a major European city and to see what the modern immigration looks like in Europe, I think Neukölln in the southeastern part of Berlin is a good place to do that. That being said, I think Berlin is an excellent place. It's got history, it's got culture, it's got art, it's got music, and it's got endless things to do. If you catch it in the summer, it's amazing. If you catch it in the winter, good luck. And I think that's going to do it for me in this video. So thank you guys for watching. If you made it this far in the video, you're an absolute legend, and I will see you in the next one.